Good evening and welcome to In Focus. Tonight, Greenland becomes the latest frontline in great power politics and a serious test of alliance rules. And an opposition leader in Greenland is calling for direct talks with Washington without Denmark, even as Greenland's foreign minister insists defense and foreign policy remain Denmark's responsibility, making any bypass illegal. At the same time, China is pushing back at being invoked in the debate, urging the United States to stop using what it calls China threat as a pretext. So is that about Arctic security or about leverage, sovereignty and rewriting the boundaries of influence between allies? I'm Rana Al-Qassas and this is In Focus, where we cut through the noise and stay with what really shifts the story. A leading Greenland opposition figure is calling for direct talks with Washington without Denmark as President Donald Trump renews pressure on Greenland. Denmark and Greenland's foreign minister say defense and foreign policy remain Denmark's responsibility, making any bypass illegal. Reuters reports Nalerak leader Pili Broberg is urging Greenland to engage the United States directly. Urging Denmark is complicating the relationship, even as Greenland's foreign minister says Denmark controls defense and foreign affairs. In a separate Reuters report, the Trump administration is said to be weighing options to sway Greenlanders, including proposals for direct payments and a compact of free association style model. Ideas Greenland's prime minister has publicly rejected as annexation talk. China has also pushed back at being invoked in the Greenland debate, with Foreign Minister spokesperson Lin Jiang urging the United States to stop using the so-called China threat as a pretext for selfish gains. The immediate question is whether this turns into formal talks or a deeper transatlantic dispute that drags the Arctic into great power politics. For more analysis, we're joined from Beijing by Mr. Marvin Ali, a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. Welcome, sir, to Qnews, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. Sir, Beijing says Washington should stop using the China threat as a pretext. Why do you think the U.S. keeps framing Greenland through China, and what is the strategic goal?
Assalamu alaikum. Shukran li istidafati barakallahu fik. From the Beijing perspective, framing Greenland for China is a narrative engineering, obviously. It lets Washington treat a complex sovereignty and alliance issue as a security emergency, which lowers the political cost of stronger military presence in this area, tighter allied discipline, and fewer moves on critical resources, especially rare earth and crude oil sources. This is what President Donald Trump likes. And strategically, Greenland offers three forms of leverage for the US. First, it's all about geography and early warning, linked to the missile and space monitoring infrastructures. Second is Arctic access and North Atlantic security logic as sea lines and operating environmental shift. And third is all about minerals and industrial security. When these are packaged as countering China or countering the rise of China, the arguments become simpler and the policy toolkit becomes broader. And there's a Chinese saying here, when you want a pretext, you can always find one here.
Sir, to just summarize what you just said, it is for the gain of the United States that China gets into this issue.
That's right.
Okay. From
So
China's
basically, they
perspective,
have
I beg your pardon?
so basically they have utilized China as an excuse to gain and maximize
For the gains
the
of the
American
United States.
national
Got your point,
interest.
sir. So, from China's perspective, is this mainly U.S. domestic politics or a real shift towards rewriting rules among allies in the Arctic?
From the Chinese perspective, they will say it's both actually. Domestic policy supplies the fuel, but the direction is structural. China's threat messaging plays well at home in the US, yet the more important signal is whether Washington feels entitled to reshape outcomes inside an allied ecosystem through pressures, incentive, or security arguments here. So if allies start feeling that autonomy can be negotiated under strategic necessary, that reads as a stretching. So there is a Chinese saying again, if you misname the issue, the reasoning that follows become distorted. So this is what the American has been doing to the rest of the world.
The reported ideas include direct payments and a COFA style arrangement. How does Beijing read that as soft power coercion, economic statecraft, or an attempt to legitimize control, sir?
Mm. President Donald Trump has mentioned that he doesn't need international rules because he set the rules here. And it makes people an impression that he is the king of the entire world. Obviously, like the Chinese people and the Chinese government do not agree with that. Beijing would read this as an economic statecraft with a legitimacy strategy. Direct payment and a COFA style model are not only about like negotiation. They can also be about constructing a consent narrative that later validates long-term control or privileged access here. So if the US can buy or purchase Greenland, so can the USA also purchase Taiwan for their own national interest? Or can China also purchase Taiwan because President Donald Trump has already set the rules? So this is
Sir,
a
what?
very important question.
Go on, sir. Go on. Sorry to interrupt.
So basically, from my perspective, President Donald Trump has already set a really a totally wrong move to the rest of the world. So the President Donald Trump has already kidnapped or arrested the president of Venezuela, and they would like to purchase Greenland. This also set a new rule for China to do the same to maximize the Chinese national interest at the same time.
Sir, do you think that China could be dragged into this?
What do you mean this?
Dragged, dragged into this issue?
Mm. Okay, let me share my perspective and some historical lessons here. Back 10 years ago, around 15 years ago, the Chinese delegate or the Chinese diplomat used to refuse about to militarization of the South China Sea, stop doing the land reclamation in the South China Sea. But USA, Japan, Australia, even the entire Western world oppose what China's claimed in the United Nations. So from the Chinese logic, it means okay, you oppose my logic, then I have the right to militarize the entire South China Sea because South China Sea used to be and now and will be the part of the Chinese sovereignty. So this is from the Chinese perspective, and they can build their own military base, the naval base here, because the Western world has already set the route.
Sir,
They are
at
the
that
rule maker.
point, was China economically stronger than it is now, or were they the same, or was it less than China's economic today? Because China, of course, comes after the United, comes less than the United States economically.
China is actually wiser than before. I won't say that
Wiser?
China is wiser than before because China right now they have been challenging USA with different dimensions, from space to rare earth, from soft power to hard power here. So from the history of the USA, they have never met an opponent that can comprehensively challenge their supremacy here. So like Pop Mart, Xiaomi, Huawei, and everything, they have been challenging the domination of the US legitimacy of like becoming a world leader. Especially USA has already resigned or quit at least 66 of the international organizations, which means this has already created a power vacuum for China and new other emerging countries like Saudi Arabia, Southeast Asia, just to allocate, fill in the gaps. Especially, this also fits the China's interest to even more to leverage their diplomatic move. So, from the Chinese diplomatic perspective here, they have been playing the art of war. So, this is a Chinese chess game to
They have
encircle the
reclaimed the
enemy
art of
bit
war.
by bit.
Okay, great, sir. How would a Greenland dispute affect China's ties with Europe, especially Denmark and the EU, at a time when Europe is already sensitive about sovereignty and alliances?
This is a really good question here. I really like this. So it would heighten Europe's sensitivity about sovereignty and alliance hierarchy here. If Europeans, publics, and institutions see pressures on Denmark and Greenland, they become more cautious about any great power uh, like putting more pressures to their own autonomy and national territory here. So basically, this is not about like affecting China's ties with Europe, also affecting China's tie with Canada, because the president of Canada will be visiting China a few days later because Canada also shares a big part of the Arctic region here. So basically, you can see the pattern of the Chinese diplomacy. They have been making friends or closer relationship with South Korea, Canada, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, and even Egypt. Why? There's one common phenomenon here to challenge the USA. This is the
And
China's
they've
main
been
goal.
working very hard on technology as well at this point. Sir, what are the key watch points in the next week? Trilateral talks, new US proposals, European pushback, or changes in the Arctic security posture that would tell us this is moving from rhetoric to policy.
So basically, it's really hard to predict the next move because President Donald Trump himself has lots of uncertainty. No one can predict him. And actually, uh, I can only share my viewpoint here. Instead of watching what the US has been doing, let's watch about how China is doing to counter Americans' effect here. So China has been making friends with the Americans' allies, the traditional allies, that the friends just to encircle or uh, counter circle the Americans' diplomacy here. So this is the first point, and the second point, I personally have been monitoring poly market because I believe that why do some people bet so much money on some like diplomatic or geopolitical topic and they have won a lot from the table. And I believe they may have some insider trading here. So this is my own perspective here. So basically, this is not just my own perspective, and everyone on Twitter, on social media, have been talking about this viewpoint here, just to see, okay, the next move of the USA. Will USA do something else to Iran or to elsewhere in the world? So like
Okay,
we
sir,
don't
because
all
I'm
know.
out
So
of
I hope
time.
there will be more
China to
peace
the
here.
United States. Stop using China threat as pretext on Greenland. Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Yes or no?
I hope there will be a world peace.
Hopefully, sir. Sir, from Beijing, that was Mr. Marvin Lee, a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. Thank you, sir, for your valuable insights and for your informative and intellectual knowledge and time on top of all, and for joining us here on Qnews. European leaders are rallying behind Denmark and Greenland, insisting the island's future can only be decided by Greenlanders in Denmark, as US pressure triggers fresh concern over sovereignty and NATO unity. After renewed US interest in Greenland, European leaders in Canada issued a joint message that Greenland belongs to its people and that only Greenland and Denmark can decide its future. Reuters reports Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni dismissed the idea of any US military move, warning it would have severe repercussions for NATO, while urging a stronger NATO presence in the Arctic to address security risks without undermining allies. At the same time, Greenland's own foreign minister says bypassing Denmark in talks is illegal because Copenhagen controls defense and foreign affairs, a point that turns this from rhetoric into illegal and an alliance test for Europe. The European question is how to deter any breach of sovereignty while keeping the transatlantic relationship intact, and whether Arctic security can be strengthened through NATO cooperation rather than pressure politics. And for further analysis, we're joined from Cairo by Dr. Mohammed Osman, our distinguished guest and international relations specialist. Welcome, sir, to Qnews, and thank you very much for joining us and for your time. Sir, from an EU law standpoint, what are the legal red lines here? How should Europe respond if any allies' sovereignty is challenged through coercion rather than contest?
Well, to begin answering your question, I will start with the legal part. Of course, what the United States is proposing, any forced or coercive acquisition of Greenland or a territorial acquisition of land or territories that are belong to the sovereignty of another country is definitely a grave violation of the UN Charter and of international law. So the US, if it tries to take Greenland away from Denmark by force, as some might now insinuate, of course, this will be a grave violation of international law, not that it will matter. As for the European Union, we always have to point out that the
sorry to interrupt you, but you said if it will matter,
yes,
which is a big question here. If it will matter with the United States, because nothing at this point, do you see that anything matters with the United States?
No, law does not matter. International law, really, they don't really care about that anymore. They never cared about it in the past, but at least they made the effort to seem to be law-abiding, and they placed some charades and veneers. Now they are completely frank and transparent with their approach. President Trump and his administration have ridiculed the United Nations and all of the symbols of international law, so they don't really care about international law. That's why it doesn't matter. For God's sake, a president of a sovereign country was kidnapped from his residence, and this is a grave violation of international law. It's an act of war, yet the US doesn't really even try to cover it up or try to justify it from an international legal standpoint. As for the European Union, Rana, coming back to your question, it is not a defensive alliance. This is not NATO. They do not really have a clause in the EU Charter that, or the Treaty of Lisbon, that stipulates collective defense in any way. So they do not have an Article 5. The Europeans are not really legally obligated to defend Denmark in this situation where the United States theoretically, of course, or hypothetically attempts to take over Greenland by force. So the European Union can voice concerns. They can threaten to send troops, even though they do not really have enough troops to maintain the own defense of their own countries. And this is what they have admitted, and this is why they are increasing their military spending since the Ukraine war. And they can protest and attempt to pressure the United States as much as possible. There is a distant possibility that maybe the European Union will muster the guts to take collective economic action against the United States. However, this will also be very destructive to the already fragile EU economies at this point. So really, Rana, the EU doesn't really have much it can do to stop the United States if the United States decides to take over Greenland. President Trump is completely consumed by the euphoria of his epic success in Venezuela and how he basically carried out a 30-minute war in order to end the rule of Nicolas Maduro and basically subdue his country by the use of force and by the threat of further destruction. And now basically he is in control of the country's oil riches, according to President Trump at least. So basically he feels unstoppable at this point. So if the Europeans really think they can stop him if he decides to take over Greenland, I don't think so.
Sir, Reuters reports Greenland's foreign minister says Denmark's control defense and foreign affairs, making any bypass is illegal. What does that mean in practice for any U.S. Greenland direct channel, and where does self-rule end and state sovereignty begin?
Well, Greenland has a certain degree of autonomy, so it has some sort of self-rule in Denmark, and Denmark basically gives it some sort of autonomy per the constitution. However, that doesn't mean that it can act beyond the sovereignty of Denmark. They are a part of the state of Denmark at the end of the day, and there are constitutional channels for secession. And of course, these are not in action. And the Greenlanders themselves have expressed, or the Greenlander government at least, has said on more than one occasion that they have no interest in joining the United States. Some of them are calling, and the majority of Greenlanders, most of them are calling for, or at least a significant proportionate majority, are calling for independence so that Greenland can become an independent country.
But sometimes, Dr. Mohammed, it's not their choice when it comes to Donald Trump.
Yeah, of course. You know, like with President Trump, basically this man has opened Pandora's box, so he's very unpredictable. I do find it very hard to imagine that the U.S. will actually carry out military action against a NATO member state and against a Nordic European country like Denmark.
It's becoming very complicated, Dr. Mohammed, to a level that everything is getting out of hands. And like your fellow guest said, I don't know if you heard him or
Yes,
not.
I've heard him, yes.
In the first segment, he
Gentleman
was
from
saying
BG.
that Donald Trump, it is he that said, not me. Donald Trump is acting like a king. He actually took a king of the world. He actually took a president from his country, from Venezuela, which is Maduro, of course, and he took him to the United States, believing that he did not win the first elections, and he wasn't the winner, and that he is involved in drug trafficking, which is how do you read it?
It's rather like it's laughable. You know, it's sad, but it's quite funny at the same time. The pretexts the U.S. administration and President Trump try to make, but they don't really care about that. President Trump came out very frankly afterwards and said we want Venezuela for the oil, and of course for enforcing the Monroe Doctrine and eliminating Russian and Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere, which is strategically sound. And by the way, U.S. aspirations to take over Greenland are also pushed by the same aspirations of the Monroe Doctrine. Greenland lies within the Western Hemisphere, and the United States sees it as a strategic area of pivotal strategic significance, Sarana. And to play devil's advocate, of course, I'm not defending or justifying in any way any potential U.S. takeover of Greenland illegally. However, this did not really exist in a vacuum. President Trump did not come up with this. The U.S. has had desires to control and annex Greenland since the 18th century.
True, sir, but Donald Trump, since he became the president of the United States, and he's been mentioning Greenland and that he will take Greenland.
Yes, but it's not the first time.
Yes,
it happened
since
before.
he came.
Yes, President Andrew Johnson in 1867 was the first to propose the idea before Congress turned it down. And also, President Truman in 1946 offered Denmark $100 million back then, which was a very, very sizable amount of money back then in 1946 to take over Greenland. And Denmark refused. And in return, they allowed the Americans to have bases on Greenland and early warning signals to detect Soviet missiles. And now Trump has renewed it. So this has been really within the strategic psyche of American decision makers. President Trump is
Do you
just
think
choosing.
Denmark can give them this opportunity, sir, at this point?
I don't think so. Maybe if we try, if we at least pretend that there are still some reason in the heads of the Americans and in everybody else's in the world, I might assume that maybe President Trump is upping the ante and pressuring the Danish so that they would reach some sort of agreement that will allow the United States to exercise effective security control and military control over Greenland without transferring sovereignty, and also taking advantage of the vast natural resources in Greenland. Greenland is rich in natural resources like rare earths, even fossil energy. So you can imagine there are billions also to be made over there, and it is strategically sound from a realist standpoint that the United States would want to have some control over Greenland at this point because of basically of the very, very strong competition between the great powers over the influence in the Arctic. The biggest country that has waters in the Arctic is Russia. And Russia is basically exploiting the Arctic unopposed. It has one of the largest the largest icebreaker fleets in the world. It has about 50 icebreakers, including 8 nuclear icebreakers that are basically breaking the ice in the North Pole and excavating for natural resources. And the United States wants to jump in the game. Do you know how many icebreakers the United States has, Rana? 5. Russia has 50. And China is investing heavily in Russia's capabilities of excavating and exploring the North Pole and the Arctic. So this is why basically this whole dispute is about. It's about who will have influence in the Arctic region, and the United States wants to expand its influence, whether in terms of resources and whether in terms of military influence and control as well. It's very strategic significance. So as part of the larger scheme or the wider picture of the great power competition between the US on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, it is rather logical that the United States would seek to have control over Greenland. However, attempting to annex it and take it forcibly from Denmark is unimaginable and jeopardizes NATO and actually puts the US-led Western alliance in dire jeopardy, and of course will work in the favor of Russia and China at the end of the day if Trump keeps behaving that way.
European leaders say only Greenland and Denmark can decide Greenland's future. Beyond statements, what credible deterrence tools does Europe actually have, politically, legally, NATO signaling, or economic measures, sir?
To be completely honest with you and realistic, Rana, probably none. The Europeans have become useless. Yeah,
Europeans have become useless. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'm becoming very blunt.
Meloni warns a military move would have severe repercussions for NATO. How real, of course, after you said they've become useless, it's another answer, but how real, sir, can you see the risk of an alliance fracture here, and what would be the minimum step Europe needs to take to protect NATO credibility?
When Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, warned Trump that if you do this, if you try to take Greenland by military force, this will be the end of NATO, she was making complete sense. She was telling the truth, because basically that would be the United States, the leading power of NATO, attacking another NATO member country, which will basically destroy this alliance forever. And it will be to the detriment of NATO as a military alliance that basically safeguards transatlantic security interests of the United States and Europe, and will also be to the detriment of US interests. I do not believe that the US has no interest in maintaining NATO. If NATO breaks down, this means that the core of their foothold and their security influence inside the European continent, which contains Russia and by association Chinese influence as well in that part of the world, will basically break and shatter, and it will open the door for further Russian expansion in Eastern Europe if this happens. Imagine what would happen in the Baltics and in Romania and even parts of Poland if the NATO collapses, for example. It will set a very dangerous precedent, and China will be even more expansionist in its surrounding areas in the South China Sea. It will be much more assertive with the issue of Taiwan. Even they would go ahead and maybe attack Taiwan in the next few years if the US destroys NATO by undermining it, by attempting to annex Greenland by force. So now basically NATO is facing an existential threat, Rana. And ironically, the existential threat is not from Russia, not from China, not from aliens from other galaxies, but from the United States itself, the country that created NATO.
Sir, do you think, before I have to wrap up, of course, this episode as soon as possible, do you think that China could be a threat and a pretext to be for the United States to stop using, or it will be indulged?
Of course, China will not really be able to do anything about this. Of course, it's not within their interest. On the one hand, it is within their interest, of course, for the West to suffer from infighting and divisions that are being created at the moment. But at the same time, if the United States widens its control and its areas of control and influence in the Arctic, it will definitely challenge Russian and by association Chinese quasi-dominance in major parts of the Arctic. And it will basically turn the Arctic into another theater where there is military mobilization, where there are potential military friction, and will basically make it another hotspot of instability that could explode at any moment. Basically, China doesn't want that. I don't think
What's
China
your
really.
point, Dr. Mohammed Osman, an international relations specialist? Of course, I would love to continue this wonderful interview, but I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your time, informative knowledge, and your, of course, intellectual knowledge, sir. And on top of all your time, tonight's story is bigger than Greenland. It is about whether the architect becomes a space governed by law and consent or by pressure and deals. For Europe, the question is how to defend sovereignty and keep NATO unity intact. For China, it is how to resist being used as a justification for new US moves. And for Washington, it is whether security arguments can translate into a political outcome without triggering a wider transatlantic rupture. I'm Rama Khassas. Thank you for watching In Focus. Good night.